Hey everyone, welcome back. Our guest today is Wade Lopp. He's a mechanical engineering major as a junior here at Oklahoma State. But I don't actually have him on here to talk about anything engineering related. Wade, you do a lot of reading and a lot of studying. What would you like to talk to us about today?
Today, my topic of conversation is probably going to be like theology, apologetics. It's what I like to read whenever I can read whatever I want. I started with C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, and then I just pulled a thread based on like what were his inspirations, read those. What were those inspirations, read those. And I've read more books on apologetics and theology than I could count. And I just love the topic. I love to discuss it. So that's where we're going to start.
Fantastic. Well, do you have a particular starting point?
So, yeah, actually, one apologetic analogy that I've seen abused a lot, I wanted to talk about. You may have heard of it already, the Clockmaker analogy.
Sounds vaguely familiar, but
So, the idea is that if you found a clock or a watch on the side of the road, you would assume there was a watchmaker because of its complexity and because of what it is, because it's a watch. And the analogy is compared to the universe as a whole. If you just found that in your pocket, you would assume someone would make it because it has so many parts that go together. And before I actually get into what the analogy is attempting to portray, I'm going to start with the ways I've seen it attacked incorrectly. All analogies break down, but I've seen this analogy attacked in ways that it doesn't actually break down. Specifically, there's two main arguments I've seen leveled against it that it actually confronts really well. The first being that the reason there are parts that work together is because it grew together. So you look at a human body and you see a liver and lungs and a heart, and you see that all these parts were made to work together. They can't work independently. So the two places we see that are in things that are grown and things that are made. So a watch is made. It has gears. The gears go together. Someone designed it to work together that way. And while, of course, Christians and theists in general believe that the human body was made to fit together to work for a certain purpose, if you take the approach that it just grew that way, that these parts grew together and that's why they're indexed together, then you can attack that theory in that way. And the reason this attack doesn't work is because a clock was selected intentionally. A watch or a clock was selected on purpose. This attack would work against a bicycle because the only thing you have to say about why you think a bicycle was designed is because the parts work together. And the same, if it grew together, then it could work together. And when you take organic stuff that grows, you could maybe apply that. But the reason that a clock was selected is because it runs down. This analogy was first coined before electric clocks and before solar clocks really are the only ones that never run down. So they had to wind up their clocks and their watches, and then eventually they would run down and stop. So yes, it was designed and it was wound. And actually the same thing's true of our universe. Our universe works together. The planets rotate each other. We interact with each other. Our bodies have parts that are put together. But more than that, it runs down. If there's any solid 100%, we know for sure scientific law, it's entropy. Everything runs down. The heat death of the universe is inevitable. Our universe is running downhill. So something or someone had to put it on top of the hill. And that's the way that the clock theory combats that argument specifically. The places that it could actually break down are that maybe there's some mechanism we don't know about that resets the clock by itself. And there's no evidence to support that. That's where the analogy breaks down. You need other evidences in order to combat that topic specifically. The other way I've seen it attacked that's just completely irrelevant is you explain the clock analogy to someone, and then they say, so anything that has attributes has a creator. And that's not what we're saying. If it has details and attributes, if you can say it's yellow and it's round and it's this big, then it must have been created by someone. And the clock theory is just simply not saying that. Like
Right.
it never even stated that. It's actually about it's designed to work together and it runs down. Therefore, someone must have set it up. Someone's winding the clock. It's clock theory.
So you're saying
someone designed it and set it on top of the hill.
So you're saying that is a good analogy, sort of as a argument for a creator.
That's right.
The
Yes.
clockwork analogy.
Of course. Yeah. You found a clock on the side of the road, especially if it's still ticking.
Yeah.
Someone made this. It didn't someone designed it and wound it at a definitive point in time too. That there was a point in time when this watch didn't exist.
Right. No, I kind of though am interested by the option of like a thing that resets the clock, which you said needs some more evidence. And so I've seen people propose that like Big Bang Theory, like it's sort of a cycle that happens. The universe, like at the end of its life, it's super contracts
Super
again,
dense,
and then it explodes again. And it's sort of like I mean, if we're still talking in the context of watches, like a Rolex is supposedly self-winding. You know, it's
right when your arm swings.
Exactly. So it theoretically wouldn't need to be wound up unless it was sitting on the side of the road, I guess, for a long time. But I mean, what are the defenses? There's also no evidence necessarily that the universe does that.
Does re-explodes. That it's cyclic.
Yeah.
Would be the word. But again, like you would go back to, we haven't seen any cycles that weren't started somewhere. And more than that, that would be a complete violation of conservation of energy. And like just from a purely scientific standpoint, like it would destroy almost everything we know about science if that sort of mechanism were possible. But it wouldn't be if it was, if there's a creator in a different reality that made this one, then this other reality could potentially have different rules. But to say that our reality has baked into it a reset mechanism is more absurd than thinking that there's a separate reality where energy can come from and creation can happen.
So, and I guess the other reality is kind of exempt from any amount of scientific.
We have no data over there. Right.
Over there.
We have very little. I shouldn't say we have no data, because like if you want to take history as it stands and believe reasonable, miraculous events, then we have a little bit of evidence. But in general, nothing like here, we have really well established conservation of energy and entropy increases. Like there's nothing more fundamental than those two.
Yeah. Well, that's what I've heard. And so, I mean, how do they feel like they can get away with just sort of proposing that as a solution? That things can come from nothing, essentially.
Well, they have to. It's and this is going to get more controversial, but your popular science is very driven by religious philosophies. That there is no other way. If they don't make up something, then they fall flat. So it's really like when you get down to brass tacks, in real debates, they lose 100 times out of 10. Or they lose 100 times out of 100. Like they won't take they won't even take scientific debates against people who want to prove the existence or disprove the existence of God because they lose so often. It really is propaganda based, believe it or not. It's really reliant on, we can't say that it must have been this way because if we did, we would be admitting that there is certainly a God.
And I mean, we learned in one of my classes about a woman who had done some research on childhood cancer. This was back in the maybe 70s or 60s or so. And she basically found out that in a lot of cases, the mother had been x-rayed like during pregnancy. And she was like, well, that's it. That's why, like, if we just stop x-raying pregnant mothers, childhood cancer rates will go down. And it took the scientific community like 25 or 30 years to actually come around to that, because they were so bent under this idea that, doctors help people. And so like they were hurting people and they didn't want to accept that.
And this happens in science all the time, that they perpetuate an idea because it's become part of their internal philosophy. And then whenever it becomes obvious that it's not true, they hold on to it really long. And you saw the same thing with spontaneous generation. They used to believe that if you just stuck meat in a box, maggots would grow in it
Right.
spontaneously. And that was the origin of life, was that things would spontaneously generate anywhere there was good energy to be consumed. And like it got disproved, and so they just stuff it further in the box. And that's what they've always done. They say, oh, no, it actually happened at a smaller level. It actually happened at the germ level, that the first life spontaneously made itself out of accidental chemicals and proteins. And it's like, the math is in. It's impossible. It will never happen. So even if somehow our universe did make itself, life didn't.
Yeah. And they will, I've heard kind of a circular thing where it's like, and I mean, this would be pretty bad coming from someone that took themselves seriously, but I've heard it still said where it's like, yeah, it happened because it happened.
Because it had to.
It had to happen. Like, we're here.
Right. They always fall back on, when you take it all the way as far as you can, they always fall back on, well, there's no other way it could have happened. There is another way. And it's less absurd than what you're postulating. And it's that a being higher and smarter and mightier than you made the whole universe on purpose for a reason.
Yeah. Well, now let me ask you this though: how do we avoid similar circular reasoning? Because there's some circularity. I don't know if that's a word. There's some circular reasoning occasionally within the creation story, and it's particularly hard to to convey that idea to people that you can't use the Bible, right? It's like you just have to, well, God made the universe because, and then where did God come from? Well, he always existed. And so there's some circular reasoning there, and sort of a sub question, but avoiding ourselves using confirmation bias, which is what happens. So it just gets embedded into their own belief system. And so then, well, this must happen because, well, I already believe this happened. So
first, you need to remember that this is probably the most important lesson in all of apologetics. You're talking to a real human that God loves more than you do. And you need to remember what you're attacking is their belief system and their religion, actually. That they believe there is no God, it's just as critical to their emotional and psychological status that there is no God as it is to yours that there is one. That it's just as much a comfort to them that there's no meaning as it is a comfort to me that God loves me and there's a purpose in my life. It's just as integral to their psyche as it is to yours. So you need to remember that so you can be very kind. And then specifically, when it comes back to the circular stuff, you need to fall back on the math and on the history. That you need to, and this is really difficult because you can really destroy someone this way. You can make them no longer trust anything because they hold this higher than their own perception oftentimes. And specifically, there's a lot in the Bible that is really solid history. And there's a lot post-Bible that's not explicable without God that's really solid history. And if you want to deny those things, then you need to deny almost all the history you've ever read in your entire life. The other thing is the math. Fall back on probabilities and math. You need to remind them that it's not as you have set this up as a fairy tale in your head just because you want to. And it's not actually more absurd to believe that a being made this mess than that it made itself or that it has always existed. It's not more absurd. And then fall back on the math and say the odds of this happening by itself are 0. It will never happen. And I don't have any of the numbers on me right now, but if you look up the statistics, what is the probability that life would spontaneously generate? It's 0. If you want to call it impossible, mathematicians will agree with you. If you want to call it all but impossible, they'll agree with you again. Never in 100 billion years will it ever happen. It's more unlikely than anything you can think of. It's beyond understanding of how unlikely it is. And then compare that to it's either this impossible odd or someone intentionally made life. And if you can get past all the biases they have, and you can really remind them that the idea of a creator is not more absurd than the idea of things existing by themselves. It's not a self-contradictory idea.
Right.
And then you compare the odds, then the creator comes out on top every time.
And that's, I mean, certainly I'm someone that agrees with that. And I'm not much of a thinker in the way you are. But like that makes sense. But I still, it's still interesting to me because they do not have all the answers at all, and that's they can try to fit it within their theory as best they can. But one thing I've heard recently that I found very interesting was the existence of sexual reproduction in animals, because they purport that we came from asexually reproducing organisms. And in every scenario, that is more advantageous for a species to asexually reproduce. And so the fact that, a good chunk of animal life reproduces sexually is very strange. Then there's no reason that should exist. And it also, the odds of you would have to have two beings, each part evolve at the same time so that they could then pass it on. You'd have to have a male and a female evolve. There's odds like that. It's like they just can't explain that. But there's plenty of things that we can't really explain without just saying, well, either is like our answer is, well, it was God. God did it. Or, well, we don't really have to understand that. And I fall in that second one a lot of the times. It's like, and that comes up a lot in specifically like Christianity, like, I think questions about heaven or what. I'm like, I don't understand it. Maybe we don't have to. And so I can see how that looks pretty circular to a lot of people on the outside.
It looks faulty. It looks like it has holes in it. Specifically with the sexual reproduction thing, that sounds more like an argument against evolution than against God.
No, yeah, that's what I'm saying.
And
there's no reason that should have evolved, and that's something that they can't explain. And then something that that we can't explain, we just say, well, God, yeah.
Right, and it's like, again, it's gonna have to. Most of the things we can't explain, we can explain why we can't explain them. If we were created by a being that's all-knowing, all-powerful, and could create the universe, then obviously there's going to be things that he set up that we don't understand. We're not as smart as he is. So that is a necessary assumption with the presupposition that God's real, is that there's going to be stuff we don't understand. And even in Scripture, it's reinforced with the wisdom of God came to shame. The foolishness of God shames the wisdom of men. That it's super baked in. And So there's specifically with philosophical questions and stuff that's really difficult, there's going to be a lot of stuff that we fall short. We don't know. We're not God, and we can't understand all of his intentions and all of his ideas. But actually, I'm glad you brought your argument where evolution falls short, because another really important thing that can help is to separate the idea of debunking evolution with debunking whether or not God's real or not. There really are separate arguments. God can use whatever mechanisms he wants to create whatever he wants over whatever period of time that he wants. And actually, slowing things down doesn't make them more incredible is another really good thing to remember. That the evolutionary mechanisms that I hear proposed nowadays all sound miraculous. None of them, they're all counter to entropy, and they're all counter to what we know about the universe. And if life was purposing towards complexity because it wanted to, like if as soon as you assign intention to it, it's God. Right? A force that's making things more in order on purpose is God. That's actually a really great description of what I would call God, is something we don't fully understand that makes things more in order, even though naturally they fall apart. So remove the idea that evolution is entirely contradictory from a creator. And then separately, we could have a different evolutionary discussion. There's a lot of ways that it falls short. But nevertheless, that separation can be very helpful for some people, because you can't even read, you can't read anything or watch anything without every 5 seconds they're assuming evolution's true. So we're just we've been very brainwashed into thinking it. Whether it's true or not, we have been. Our presupposition is that evolution's true and that we evolved from apes. It's just, and you're going to have a really hard time separating that idea. So it's better to attack one thing at a time. And again, attack is a rough word.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. To
argue against.
Discuss one thing at a time. Discuss is the way to go.
But I want to dig in a little bit here, because if you can, because you're right, evolution is ingrained in discourse. It's just, quote unquote, it's real as far as most people are concerned. And most people then can accept it without accepting God. You're saying that they're separate, and I can see that. But if most people have already accepted that evolution can be real without accepting that a God did it, and I mean, to your point, you're like, it's miraculous. But if they can accept that, and if they can accept that entropy can kind of be set aside in a certain way, then does that not then they just can work backwards and say, well, if this happened, then this happened, and this happened, so then the universe must have made itself, quote unquote. I mean, it must have just sort of come from exactly how we said it came from.
Well, if it does get in the way, take it down. That would be my advice. Evolution's no harder to beat than atheism or agnosticism. And if it does get in the way, apologetics is a very personal thing. You can't make an apologetic formula that's going to turn over Christians by the thousands. You need to use apologetics on your best friend and on your mom. And it's something that's it's probably never going to stop. It's going to be something that you're reinforcing over time, and that you're doing because you love someone. In fact, if you're just using apologetic arguments to win arguments, I would please ask you to stop. Because what we don't want is to beat people and crush them with our intellectual might. We don't want that. We want to persuade people we love to see the truth. And that is the most central thing. If you don't have that mastered, don't start trying to do apologetics at all.
I think that's a really good point.
And if evolution gets in the way, then take it down too. But it might not.
Well, and you're right. It may not. I think there are a lot of people that they do find a way and believe in both.
And we don't have a responsibility to convince people of our preferred scientific theories. We do have a responsibility to convince everyone that Jesus is the Christ,
Yeah.
and that through him comes salvation.
Right. Well, I remember you did. I'll call it a short series of talks where you kind of walked, and I just was reminded of this as you were sort of using math and history to explain why a God kind of has to exist. And that was kind of where you started with those talks, and you progressed through. You remember what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I actually started those talks from a much more philosophical ground base. I started with the everyone's moral compass and your capacity to recognize good and evil. And I think that's a great route for your philosophically inclined. I myself don't trust philosophical arguments very much, and I think most people don't, because they just feel like they're being outsmarted and that they're not actually being confronted with solid evidence. So at least I do. My faith couldn't be based on philosophy alone. It had to be backed up with history and math for me.
And I think that's fair. And that's probably how a lot of people see it. I think, like it or not, evolution and science as a whole has been put at odds against God, at least in the way most people think about it. It's like you either believe in science or you believe in God. And that's just how people see it.
Yeah. And we have been conditioned to feel that way. But when you actually look into the origins of science, you'll notice that Western science, the way it sprung up, didn't spring up at all in the East. And that's because science's foundations are very based on a reality that we can touch and feel, and they're really based on Christian presuppositions that truth is real and things are a certain way because they are that way. And a lot of presuppositions in the human mind that came from Christianity had to be really solidly established before science started to become a real thing. And science is actually a very young thing when you consider the actual time span of humanity, even if you don't think the Earth is billions of years old. Even if you only think it's 20,000 years old, science hasn't really existed and really been at work until for the last 1,000 years.
Yeah.
So science is an anomaly that emerged because of Christ taking over all of Europe.
Yeah.
Well, and when you, just a little longer, when you destroy the philosophies that built science, science will die too. And this is something that's well articulated in C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man and the Escape from Reason. The author's name has left me. You look up Escape from Reason. He is...
I'll find it.
He is the author. So it's well established there that if we continue rolling down this path that we are as a culture of debasing absolute truth and debunking the idea that things can have intrinsic properties, then science will die as well. And we may have already seen some of that.
That's what that's all I was thinking about.
That science has become very opinion filled.
Yeah. It's Francis Schaeffer, by the way. Is that
Francis Schaeffer? That's right. Escape from Reason by Francis Schaeffer and The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis do a very good job of the understanding the ramifications of destroying real truth as a culture.
So what we've seen, I guess, then what you're saying is this, and it reminds me of in the Jurassic Park when Jeff Goldblum's character does that, man creates God, God creates man, man creates science destroys God. That whole, um, it's like, Christ came and then through Judeo-Christian, is that fair? That's where science sort of sprung from. And then now we've slowly been eroding the God part away from science. And it's now becoming more and more
Yeah, you can't
subjective.
Right. You can't keep the science and kill the God.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing that you said that I hadn't thought of, that science is based on like the presupposition of truth.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you mentioned it didn't come up in the East. Can you tell me a little bit why that is?
Well, in the Eastern thought, and I'm not an Eastern man for one, so I can't. I have trouble. All Western people will have a lot of trouble trying to fully understand the way Eastern philosophies think. But I have done a little bit of studying on Eastern philosophy in general. But there's just no emphasis on absolute truth. There's just that idea would be very difficult to convey to Confucius or Lao Tzu, that no, this is true regardless of what you saw or what you think. We actually we have an absolute baseline truth that A is equal to B and B is equal to C, therefore A is equal to C. They wouldn't actually care. They don't piece the world up like that. Because in order to do that, you have to piece the world up into separate objects that are acting on each other. And they don't think that way. The whole world is integrated into itself. That there is no, I and you are not separate in the Eastern mind. So it's just a totally different outlook. It's a totally different paradigm is the right word.
You don't see they don't see sort of two dominoes colliding as separate object interacting with a separate object.
They see a wave.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways, it's true. Actually, the Eastern point of view and the Western point of view are just different points of view on the same thing. And you'll actually see that in the West, Christianity feels like an Eastern religion. And in the East, it feels like a Western religion. And that's because it's true. It's because it's neither and both. That you have a lot of trouble specifically teaching Westerners the very Eastern ideas that are necessary to be a Christian.
Eastern ideas like what?
Like the wave, that everything's connected. All men are brothers. Mankind is one organism. Those things are really difficult for Westerners. And in the East, it makes perfect sense. You even, all throughout the Bible, you hear the prophecies say, this and this will happen to Adam. Adam's been dead for 1,000 years. What they mean is all men.
Yeah.
They mean the sons of Adam. They'll say many of the prophecies about Jesus, the actual wording is such and such will happen to the son of David or to David. And they just mean all of David's descendants because they're David. They're what's left of him.
Right.
And that stuff comes easily. It's super the way they think in the East. They often goes by their last name first, right?
Because it's the idea of the ancestor.
Right. It's the paradigm is so much different. And there's 100,000 examples, and I don't have all of them in my pocket. But
well, let me ask you this. I know a lot of Eastern cultures are very collectivist cultures. You serve the general well-being of everyone else. And a lot of Western cultures are more individualistic. Now, a lot of Western culture is founded somewhat heavily in Christian,
Judeo-Christian thought.
Exactly. But what you're saying now is not an individualistic necessarily idea. So how did we get farther away? I guess I'm assuming we've gotten far away from the Judeo-Christian origin of a more collectivist human existence.
I wouldn't say that the collectivist human existence was ever dominant in the West. That the West's ideology and presuppositions have been very dominated by Greek culture since written history, probably. And the Greeks dissected things and attempted to define things. And this is a really great way to see the difference between Western and Eastern thought, is that the Greeks would sit in a circle for hours trying to define a chair. They're like, what is a chair? It has to have 4 legs and somewhere to sit and a back. And then someone would bring in a rolly chair. And then they would spend another 45 minutes trying to fit that in their definition, because it's definitely a chair. And in the East, they'd just say a chair is anything you sit on. And they'd just be done with it. And they would actually, a chair is defined by whether or not you sit on it. When I sit on a stump, it's a chair now. And their speech, their thinking, it's all way less object oriented and way more, it's whatever I'm doing to it is what it is. And the Western world has been dominated by that way of thinking since the Greeks. And Christ, when Christ came, obviously he has God's presuppositions, right? He's to try to understand what he thought and what his consciousness was like is really difficult and beyond what we should attempt. But because Christianity started in the West, it's been fit in that box pretty much since its inception. And it's really not what it is. It's not definitive of Judeo-Christian thought. It's definitive Western Judeo-Christian thought.
Gotcha.
And when it has spread into the East, you get, and it has. There's been some good success, and you actually see a lot of Christian mysticism comes out, and Christians that spend more time thinking like Easterners, and it's really important as a good Christian who wants to see the truth to embed yourself as much as you can in both.
And how do we do that?
Well, that's a good question. That's a great question. Stay in the scriptures. The biggest document that exists that really captures the truth is the Bible. Stay in it day in and day out and commit your understanding. You do everything you can to try to understand everything through the lens of your Bible. Stay in the gospel, stay in the Old Testament. Read the book. It will form your mind to be what it needs to be.
Now, on the subject of the Bible, something I never do research into, but I'm always vaguely concerned about, is the idea that some of the Bible is not historically accurate. And I'm sure you're familiar with some of those complaints, and then hopefully you're familiar with some of those defenses.
Right. So, yeah, I am familiar with those complaints, and this actually ties in really well to the Eastern, Western, and modern points of view, that no one was really concerned about the historical reliability of this document until like 1100 AD. Like literally is that recent that people really thought, did that actually happen? Or is this just what the author wrote? They didn't think that way almost at all. They were just concerned with the stories. And the Hebrew people have the longest, most reliable tradition of historical preservation of any culture in history ever. Their methods for recreating a document exactly the way that it was last time are unmatched. They do a ridiculous number of checks and verification steps to make sure that when they make a copy of a previous manuscript, it is exactly the same. They count the number of letters. They count the number of times each letter appeared. They check to see the center letter and make sure it's still the center letter on the next copy. It's so incredibly good that when they have finished making a copy that's been fully verified, they consider it more accurate than the previous copy because it's fresh and it's on new paper. And they've been doing this, and we have copies of their manuscripts that they've copied through this tradition that have up to 1,000 years of separation. For a really long time, our oldest copy of Isaiah was from 1100 AD, which is really not old. But then we found a cave in the Middle East somewhere that had a copy from 100 BC.
Oh, wow.
And it was word for word exactly the same. The printing press did not exist during this time. This was copied by scribes for 1,000 years, and it was never changed. Not a tot nor tittle, as the Bible itself says. Jesus said, no piece of the law will be removed till the end of time. And he meant it. God selected the Jewish people and trained them to copy these documents because he wants them to be the same forever. Now, whether or not the stories specifically, so can we trust that these words are what was written by the author? The answer is yes, we absolutely can. Whoever wrote the books that are in the Bible has stayed that way since it was written. We can be totally sure. Were those stories real history, or were they myths? Were they just stories to teach lessons, or were they really, really true? Is a totally different argument that I'm less qualified to answer. Some people say yes, some people say no. You have some of your really prominent, solid, Orthodox Christians today say, yes, every single word of the Bible is the veritable truth. And then you have others that are still prominent and their opinions are important, that say some of it is just stories and some of it is actual history, and telling between is difficult. It's really hard to say any of the genealogies are just stories. And the genealogies date all the way back to Adam.
Right.
It's like, who's writing this stuff down? Why would you just remember how long Adam, like, what's the moral lesson from remembering that Adam lived for 900 years? So it would be really hard to discount that as just a story. But then there's other things like Job. Job isn't given a genealogy. And some of the events just sound absurd. So is this history? Was it a story? Like C.S. Lewis believed that Job was just a story. That was just to emphasize that faith in God will always come back, will always be better than losing faith. You'd never to revoke God under any circumstances. But there's a lot of prominent, well-informed Christians that believe Job is an actual history too.
So was that the only one that C.S. Lewis mentions? Because I was going to ask.
Yeah, explicitly. I think it's the only one he mentions. I know a lot of people think the early Genesis stories of Adam and Eve in the garden are just stories. But I'm inclined to treat them all like facts and let God sort it out when I'm done.
Yeah, because for us, ultimately, it doesn't matter a whole lot.
Right. It's the story. And like I said, they weren't interested in whether or not this actually happened until a few thousand years ago.
It represented a truth that they could then reference.
That's from God.
Yeah.
And that's all that really matters.
Right. And again, I'll add the emphasis to us because I'm still kind of looking at this sort of as information to convey to other people and people that don't believe. And I think there are a lot of people that at the very least appreciate some of the stories in the Bible. Like I think most people, and even like the teachings of Jesus, as like, no, I mean, there's some good moral content there for sure. And Jesus even himself is a person. I mean, there's some confirmation he exists, but it's not near as thorough as I would think it would be necessarily.
That's where you're wrong, kiddo. Jesus of Nazareth was a real man who walked the earth, and that is a historical fact, that when you abandon, you lose anything and everything. Actually, even afterwards, up to like until the printing press, if you want to give up and say Jesus didn't exist, that he was just a a figure that was made up for religious reasons, then you're going to have to abandon every character that ever existed till the printing press, and maybe more. There's more evidence that Jesus of Nazareth was a real man that walked the earth than you could believe. Like, you would be shocked. And it's not just from Christian sources. You have your Roman histories mention Jesus as a real man who was executed and worshipped as God. So that's just pure propaganda. If anyone, there's no real historian, no one who actually takes history seriously believes that Jesus wasn't a real man who walked the earth. And then, just as solid as that fact that Jesus did exist, he was executed, and the tomb was empty 3 days later. Those three facts are uncontestable. They're extremely backed up by all history. If you want to say that either he never rose, or he was never removed from the tomb, or that he was thrown in a common grave, all that stuff's pure. It's just lies. It's propaganda. There's no evidence to support it. There's a lot of evidence against it. Jesus was a man who walked the earth. He said the things in your Bible, and he was executed for what he said. And 3 days after his execution, his tomb was empty. The Romans had no reason to remove him from his tomb. The Jews had no reason to remove him from his tomb. And his disciples were incapable. He removed himself. He was witnessed by up to 500 people at one time after his death. And he did most certainly die. He was vetted to be dead by multiple Roman executioners whose their job is to kill people. And they said he was dead. He was very dead when he went in the tomb. And when he came back, he was the epitome of life and health. If he was beaten and nailed to a cross, 3 days later, he could not have convinced his followers that he was the God of life. Unless he was risen from the dead.
Yeah.
Jesus even says in the Gospels, he says, "For those who want signs, I will give them none but the sign of Jonah." And he's referring to when Jonah was swallowed by the whale for 3 days and returned back. He's saying that I will establish the fact that I slept, that I was dead for 3 days, and that I came back. And it is very well established in history that you have to discount all of the testimony of his believers entirely, which is a completely absurd thing to do, in order to not believe that he rose from the dead. And then even when you do that, you're still stuck with the facts that he was a real man, he was executed for what he said, and the tomb was empty 3 days later.
Well, and you said something the other day that I really liked, and it was sort of along those lines, and it was a pretty base level understanding of Christianity. I don't know if you remember it necessarily, but you basically just were like, yeah, it was similar to that. And you were like, and people knew him, and then they were changed. They were different than they were before.
Right.
Do you know what I'm saying? Because I want you to say it.
That's his followers before he died were like a fisherman and a tax collector and a group of cowards who spread and ran away when their master was taken and executed because they were scared to death that the Romans would take them too and execute them for association with him. And then 10 days later, they were the most powerful, most present, intelligent, religious founders of all time. And they were killed by torture for refusing to admit that he rose from the grave 3 days later. That these are just normal Joes off the street. And after seeing him risen from the dead, They were willing to be hung upside down, killed by dogs, tortured to death before they would concede that he wasn't raised from the dead. And it's completely absurd. And actually, this continued for 300 years, that everyone who was convinced and preached to about this man and taught by his followers was killed by torture for refusing to admit that he wasn't risen from the dead.
Yeah. And that's powerful.
Yeah.
I mean,
We have 300 years of literature from people who would say things like, all my years of service, my king has never done me wrong. Why would I turn him down now? And then being burned at a stake for saying that out loud.
Yeah. And so, definitely the way I look at it is what choice do we have? Yeah.
Right.
It seems pretty clear, but, we're getting close to time. So I mean, you have any sort of closing thoughts?
Again, be gracious, be kind. I intended this talk as an apologetic tutorial and kickoff, and just the ideas behind Christianity, that they're founded in reason, in fact, and in reality. If you're gonna discuss and argue with your loved ones, remember that they are your loved ones, and that you're not trying to crush their ideology. You're trying to turn them to the truth. You want to make believers of all men. Remember that God and Jesus loves them and wants what's best for them, and so do you.
Yeah. I think love is a big part in it. I think there's a big lack of love in the world.
Yeah. And it's you see people argue all the time about, are we supposed to be truthful, or are we supposed to love them? And the truth is that they're inseparable. Love and truth are in tension. If you loved someone, you'd tell them the truth. And if you tell them the truth to destroy them, then you don't love them.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Wade, thank you so much. I think that's really good. That's a good place to end it. So appreciate your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.